Marcus Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below like scattered diamonds. At 62, he had built an empire that spanned real estate, technology, and luxury hotels across 3 continents. His weathered hands, which had signed billion-dollar deals, now trembled slightly as he held a medical report that changed everything. The doctors had been clear: 6 months, maybe 8 if he was lucky. The cancer had spread too far, too fast. All the money in the world couldn't buy him more time, but it could secure his legacy. His thoughts turned to his only son, David, who at 28 seemed more interested in racing cars and attending parties than running Wellington Industries. David had always been a disappointment in Marcus's eyes. Born into privilege, the young man had never known struggle or hardship. He moved through life with the careless confidence that only unlimited wealth could provide. 3 failed relationships, 2 dropped college attempts, and countless scandals had painted him as nothing more than another spoiled rich kid in the tabloids. But Marcus had a plan, a test that would determine if his son was worthy of the Wellington name and fortune. The next morning, Marcus called David to his study. The room was filled with mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and portraits of Wellington ancestors who had built the family fortune from nothing. David slouched in the antique chair across from his father's massive desk, already looking bored. "I'm dying," Marcus announced without ceremony. David's expression shifted from annoyance to shock. "What? Dad? What are you talking about?" Marcus slid the medical report across the desk. "Pancreatic cancer. Advanced stage. I have months, not years." For a moment, David was speechless. Despite their difficult relationship, Marcus was still his father. The only parent he had known since his mother died in a car accident when he was 12. "There must be something we can do," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The best doctors, experimental treatments." "I've explored every option," Marcus replied coldly. "What matters now is what happens to our company, our legacy. I won't leave everything I've built to someone who isn't ready for the responsibility." David straightened in his chair. "I'm your son. I'm the heir to Wellington Industries. Being my son gave you opportunities, not guarantees," Marcus said. "You've wasted every chance I've given you, but I'm willing to offer you one final test." He pressed a button on his desk, and his assistant, Mrs. Chen, entered with a manila folder. "Inside this folder are profiles of 12 women," Marcus explained. "All of them are successful models, actresses, and socialites. Each one comes from good families with excellent reputations. You have 30 days to choose one of them to marry." David stared at his father in disbelief. "You want me to pick a wife like I'm choosing a car? I want you to choose a partner who can stand beside you as the head of this company. Someone with grace, intelligence, and the ability to represent the Wellington name in society. Marriage isn't about love, David. It's about alliance, compatibility, and building something greater than yourself." "That's the most cynical thing I've ever heard," David protested. "It's realistic," Marcus countered. "Your grandmother was chosen for my father in exactly this way. They built a partnership that lasted 45 years and expanded our wealth tenfold. Love is a luxury that men in our position cannot afford to prioritize." David flipped through the folder, seeing glossy photographs of beautiful women accompanied by detailed biographies. Each profile read like a resume: education, family background, social connections, and net worth. They were all stunning, accomplished, and completely interchangeable in their perfection. "What if I refuse?" David asked. Marcus's eyes hardened. "Then you'll receive a modest trust fund that will keep you comfortable. But Wellington Industries will be sold, and the proceeds donated to charity. The Wellington name dies with me." The threat hung in the air like smoke. David had never worked a day in his life outside of the company. The thought of starting over with nothing terrified him more than he cared to admit. 30 days, Marcus repeated. Choose wisely. Your future depends on it. As David left his father's study, his mind raced with questions and resentment. How could his father reduce something as personal as marriage to a business transaction? But underneath his anger was a deeper fear. What if Marcus was right? What if David really was nothing more than a spoiled child who had never proven himself worthy of anything? The Wellington mansion buzzed with activity over the following days. Marcus had arranged for several of the women from the folder to attend various social events at the house. Charity galas, business dinners, and cocktail parties became elaborate auditions where David was expected to evaluate potential wives like he was shopping for art. Helena Morrison was a former Miss Universe who now ran her own fashion line. She spoke 4 languages and had a master's degree in international business. During dinner, she discussed market trends in Asia with the same ease that she talked about her recent photo shoot in Paris. Sophia Vanderberg came from old European money and had spent her summers at the same Swiss finishing school as 3 princesses. She played piano beautifully and could recite poetry in Latin, but her conversation felt rehearsed, as if she had been preparing for this exact scenario her entire life. Rebecca Thompson was a successful actress who had just finished filming a major Hollywood blockbuster. She was witty, charming, and photographed beautifully beside David at every event they attended together. The tabloids were already speculating about their relationship. Each woman was perfect on paper. They were educated, refined, and came with social connections that would benefit Wellington Industries. But as David spent time with them, he felt like he was participating in an elaborate performance where everyone knew their lines except him. Late one evening, after another exhausting dinner party, David found himself alone in the kitchen looking for something to eat. The catering staff had long since departed, and the house was quiet except for the soft sounds of cleaning coming from the service areas. That's when he first noticed Rosa Martinez. She was wiping down the marble countertops with careful, methodical movements. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the plain blue uniform that all the housekeeping staff used. She couldn't have been older than 25, and there was something about the way she moved that suggested both grace and purpose. "Excuse me," David said, startling her. "I didn't mean to scare you. I was just looking for something to eat." Rosa turned toward him, and David was struck by her eyes. They were warm brown, intelligent, and completely unguarded. She didn't look at him the way the models did, with calculated interest and practiced smiles. She just looked at him like he was another person. "There's leftover chicken from dinner in the refrigerator," she said with a slight accent that David couldn't quite place. "I can heat some up for you if you'd like." "No, please don't trouble yourself," David replied. "I can manage." But Rosa was already moving toward the refrigerator, pulling out containers and preparing a plate. "It's no trouble. That's what I'm here for." As she worked, David found himself watching her. Her movements were efficient, but not hurried. She arranged the food on the plate with the same care that the expensive caterers used, making even leftovers look appetizing. "You're new," David observed. "I haven't seen you before." "I started 3 weeks ago," Rosa explained, sliding the plate into the microwave. "Mrs. Peterson hired me through the agency." Mrs. Peterson was the head housekeeper who had worked for the Wellington family for over 20 years. She was notoriously selective about the staff she hired. "Where did you work before this?" David asked, surprising himself with his curiosity. "Different places," Rosa answered vaguely. "Hotels mostly, some private homes." The microwave chimed, and she set the warm plate in front of him along with silverware and a napkin. The simple kindness of the gesture struck David as more genuine than all the elaborate attention he had received from the women his father wanted him to consider. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. Rosa nodded and turned back to her cleaning, but David found himself reluctant to leave. "What's your last name?" he asked. She paused in her work. Martinez. Rosa Martinez. I'm David, he said, then immediately felt foolish. Of course she knew who he was. I know, Rosa replied with the hint of a smile. Your picture is in all the newspapers. David felt heat rise in his cheeks. The newspapers had not been kind in their coverage of his romantic life lately. Not always for the best reasons. People write many things, Rosa said diplomatically. Most of it is probably not true. Her simple acceptance caught David off guard. He was used to people either judging him based on tabloid stories or trying to use those stories to get closer to him. Rosa seemed to do neither. You speak very good English, David observed. Where are you from originally? Honduras, Rosa replied, but I came here when I was 15. I've been in America for 10 years now. David did quick math in his head. That would make her 25, just 3 years younger than him. But her experiences had clearly been very different from his privileged upbringing. Do you like working here? He asked. Rosa considered the question seriously. Your family treats the staff well, the work is honest and the pay is fair. I'm grateful for the opportunity. There was no flattery in her response, no attempt to curry favor. She was simply stating facts, and David found her honesty refreshing after weeks of calculated charm from his father's chosen candidates. The kitchen door swung open, and Mrs. Peterson appeared, her stern expression softening when she saw David. Master David, I didn't realize you were still up, she said. Rosa, you can finish the kitchen tomorrow morning, it's getting late. Of course, Mrs. Peterson, Rosa replied, immediately putting away her cleaning supplies. As she prepared to leave, Rosa turned back to David. Enjoy your dinner, she said simply, then disappeared through the service door. David sat alone in the massive kitchen, eating reheated chicken and thinking about brown eyes and genuine smiles. For the first time in weeks, he had met someone who didn't seem to want anything from him except to do her job well. It was a dangerous thought, and David knew it. His father's ultimatum was clear, and Rosa Martinez certainly wasn't on the approved list of potential wives. But as David finished his meal in the quiet kitchen, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had served him with such simple kindness. The stakes were higher than just his inheritance. His father's entire legacy hung in the balance, along with thousands of jobs and a business empire that had taken 3 generations to build. David knew he should focus on the task at hand and choose one of the accomplished women his father had selected. But sometimes the heart has its own plans, and David Wellington was about to learn that lesson in the most unexpected way. Over the following days, David found himself making excuses to visit the kitchen at unusual hours. He would claim he needed water or was looking for a late-night snack, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than he wanted to admit. He was hoping to see Rosa again. Their conversations started small. Rosa would ask if he needed anything while she worked, and David would linger, asking questions about her day or commenting on the weather. Gradually, their exchanges grew longer and more personal. David learned that Rosa sent most of her earnings back to Honduras to support her younger siblings and her grandmother. Her parents had died in a hurricane when she was 17, leaving her responsible for her family's survival. She had worked 3 jobs while learning English at night school, never complaining about the burden that would have crushed someone with less determination. I don't understand, David said one evening as he watched Rosa organize the pantry with military precision. Why don't your siblings come here too? There are programs that help families reunite. Rosa paused, holding a can of tomatoes. The immigration process is very complicated and expensive. It can take years, sometimes decades. My brother Miguel is studying to be a teacher, and my sister Carmen is only 16. They're better off staying with my grandmother for now. David thought about his own 16-year-old self, worried about nothing more serious than which sports car to drive to school. The contrast made him uncomfortable. "What about you?" Rosa asked, turning the conversation away from herself. "What did you want to be when you were young, before you knew you would run your father's company?" The question caught David off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. Everyone assumed he had always wanted to inherit Wellington Industries. "A teacher, actually," David admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "I wanted to teach history. I loved reading about ancient civilizations and how societies developed. I thought it would be amazing to help young people understand how the past shaped the present." Rosa smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "That's a beautiful dream. Why didn't you pursue it?" David laughed bitterly. "My father made it clear that Wellington men don't become teachers. We build empires, not lecture halls. He sent me to business school instead, though I dropped out twice before finally graduating." "It's not too late," Rosa said quietly. "You could still teach if you wanted to." "No," David replied firmly. "I have responsibilities now. My father is dying, and I have to prove I'm worthy of taking over the company. I don't have the luxury of following childhood dreams." Rosa studied his face with those perceptive brown eyes. Sometimes the things we think are luxuries are actually necessities. A person who doesn't follow their heart becomes bitter, and bitter people make poor leaders. Her words stayed with David long after their conversation ended. Rosa had a way of cutting through his defenses with simple truths that were impossible to argue against. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his campaign to marry David off to one of his approved candidates. The pressure was becoming overwhelming as the 30-day deadline approached. Helena Morrison had practically moved into the guest wing, appearing at every meal and event with increasing confidence that she would be chosen. Rebecca Thompson called daily, and her agent had started dropping hints to gossip columnists about an upcoming engagement announcement. But David's heart wasn't in the courtship process. He went through the motions, attending dinners and social events. But his thoughts kept drifting to quiet conversations in the kitchen and the woman who treated him like a person instead of a prize to be won. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. David had endured another painful dinner with Sophia Vanderberg, who spent 2 hours discussing her family's genealogy and their connections to European nobility. As soon as politeness allowed, he escaped to his favorite refuge in the kitchen. He found Rosa there, but she wasn't working. She was sitting at the small staff table in the corner, staring at a letter with tears streaming down her face. When she saw David, she quickly tried to wipe her eyes and stand up. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize anyone was coming. I'll go clean somewhere else." "Rosa, wait," David said, moving closer. "What's wrong? What happened?" She hesitated, clearly torn between her desire for privacy and her need to talk to someone. Finally, the weight of whatever news she had received proved too heavy to bear alone. "It's my grandmother," she whispered. "She's in the hospital. The doctors say she might not recover this time. My brother wrote that I should come home as soon as possible if I want to say goodbye." David's heart clenched. "Then you need to go, right now, tonight." Rosa shook her head, fresh tears falling. "I can't afford the ticket. And even if I could, Mrs. Peterson said she can't hold my job if I leave without proper notice. I need this work. My family depends on the money I send home." The injustice of the situation hit David like a physical blow. Rosa, who worked harder than anyone he knew and never asked for anything, couldn't afford to be with her dying grandmother because she needed to keep cleaning his family's house. "How much?" David asked. "What? How much for the ticket, and how much do you send home each month?" Rosa looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Wellington, I can't accept charity. I wasn't telling you this to ask for money." "It's not charity," David said firmly. "It's what's right. Tell me the numbers." Reluctantly, Rosa admitted that a last-minute ticket to Honduras would cost nearly $2,000, and she typically sent home $800 each month to support her family. Without hesitation, David pulled out his phone and called his personal assistant. Within 20 minutes, Rosa had a first-class ticket on a flight leaving in 3 hours, plus enough money to cover her family's expenses for the next 6 months. "I can't accept this," Rosa protested, even as David arranged for his driver to take her to the airport. "You can and you will," David replied. "Family is the most important thing in the world. Everything else can wait." Rosa stared at him through her tears. "Why are you doing this?" David couldn't give her the complete truth. He couldn't tell her that she had become the most important part of his day, or that her kindness had awakened something in him that he didn't know existed. Instead, he said simply, "Because you would do the same for anyone else if you could. It's who you are." As Rosa left for the airport, David realized something had fundamentally shifted inside him. The women his father wanted him to marry were beautiful and accomplished, but none of them had ever moved him the way Rosa's quiet strength and compassion did. Rosa was gone for 2 weeks. During that time, David went through the motions of his father's marriage test with increasing reluctance. Helena Morrison began planning their engagement party before he had even proposed. Sophia Vanderberg's mother started discussing wedding venues and guest lists. The pressure was mounting from all sides. But David found himself missing Rosa's presence in the house like a physical ache. The kitchen felt empty without her gentle efficiency. The mansion seemed colder without her warm smile and genuine concern for others. When Rosa finally returned, David was waiting in the kitchen with flowers and a welcome-home meal he had prepared himself. It was clumsy and overcooked, but Rosa's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You didn't have to do this," she said, accepting the slightly wilted bouquet. "How is your grandmother?" David asked. Rosa's smile became bittersweet. "She passed away peacefully 3 days ago. I was able to be with her at the end, holding her hand. She told me she was proud of the woman I had become, and that she knew I would take care of our family. I can never repay you for giving me that gift." David felt tears prick his own eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "She lived a good life," Rosa said simply. 87 years full of love and hard work. She raised 6 children and 23 grandchildren. The funeral was beautiful. The whole village came to honor her. As Rosa talked about her grandmother's life and the celebration of her memory, David was struck again by her resilience and grace. She had faced devastating loss with dignity and strength, finding comfort in family bonds and shared memories rather than bitterness or despair. "There's something else," Rosa said hesitantly. "While I was home, my brother Miguel received a scholarship to finish his teaching degree at the university in the capital, and my sister Carmen was accepted into a program that will help her study nursing. The money you gave us made it possible for them to accept these opportunities." David felt a warmth spread through his chest. "That's wonderful. You must be so proud." "I am," Rosa replied. "But it also means I won't be able to support them the way I have been. They'll be in school full-time and can't work. I need to find a way to send more money home." David opened his mouth to offer more financial help, but Rosa held up her hand. "Before you say anything," she continued, "I want you to know that I've decided to look for additional work. Mrs. Peterson says I can work part-time here and find evening or weekend jobs elsewhere. I'm grateful for your kindness, but I need to solve this problem myself." Her determination was both admirable and frustrating. David wanted to simply take care of her financial worries, but he was beginning to understand that Rosa's independence and self-reliance were core parts of who she was. To take that away from her would be like caging a bird. "I respect your decision," David said carefully. "But if you ever need anything, please know that you can ask me." Rosa nodded, then looked around the kitchen they had shared so many conversations in. "What about you? How goes the search for a wife?" The question hit David like cold water. in the warmth of Rosa's return. He had temporarily forgotten about his father's ultimatum. Only 12 days remained before he had to make his choice, and Marcus was growing increasingly impatient with David's apparent indecision. "It's complicated," David admitted. Rosa's expression became carefully neutral. "I'm sure you'll choose well. The women I've seen at the house are all very accomplished and beautiful." There was something in her tone that made David look at her more closely. Was that hurt in her eyes? Did Rosa care about his eventual marriage more than she was letting on? "Rosa," David began, then stopped. What could he say? That he had feelings for her, that he would rather spend his life having conversations in this kitchen than attending charity galas with socialites, that her smile meant more to him than all his father's money. The gulf between their worlds felt insurmountable. David was heir to a billion-dollar empire, and Rosa was a housekeeping staff member trying to support her family in Honduras. His father would never accept such a choice, and David wasn't sure he had the courage to defy Marcus even if he wanted to. But as David looked into Rosa's eyes, he realized he was falling in love with her. Not the calculated affection his father wanted him to develop for one of the approved candidates, but real, deep, transformative love that changed how he saw everything else in his life. The question was whether he was brave enough to choose love over legacy, and whether Rosa could ever feel the same way about him. The next 12 days would determine not just David's future, but the future of everyone whose lives depended on the choices he made. The clock was ticking. With only 8 days left before Marcus's deadline, the pressure in the Wellington mansion reached a breaking point. Helena Morrison had essentially moved in, treating the house as if she were already the lady of the manor. Her assistants came and went with wedding magazines and sample invitations. Rebecca Thompson called every few hours, and gossip columnists were placing bets on which woman David would choose. Marcus summoned his son to his study for daily updates, growing more frustrated with each conversation. "You're running out of time," Marcus warned during one particularly tense meeting. "Helena's family has excellent connections in European markets, and Rebecca's celebrity status would be valuable for our hospitality division. Either choice would benefit the company immensely." David shifted in his chair, avoiding his father's penetrating stare. "I understand the business advantages, but shouldn't there be more to marriage than corporate synergy?" Marcus's eyes flashed with anger. "More? You mean sentiment? Romance?" "David, you're not some middle-class romantic. You're a Wellington. Our marriages are investments in the future of everything we've built." "Maybe that's what's wrong with our family," David muttered. "What did you say?" David looked up at his father, this powerful man who had controlled every aspect of his life. "I said maybe that's what's wrong with our family. When's the last time you were truly happy, Dad? When's the last time you felt joy that wasn't connected to a business deal or a profit margin?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less determined. "Happiness is a luxury I couldn't afford when I was building this empire. I sacrificed my personal desires so that you could have choices I never had. Don't throw that away for some romantic fantasy." "What if it's not fantasy?" David asked quietly. Marcus studied his son with new intensity. "David, have you met someone? Someone not on the list?" The direct question caught David off guard. He had never been good at lying to his father, and Marcus's sharp business instincts were now focused entirely on him. "I need more time to think," David said, evading the question. "You have 8 days," Marcus replied coldly. "Use them wisely." That evening, David found Rosa in the garden behind the mansion. She was sitting on a stone bench, reading a book by the light of the pathway lamps. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path. "Mr. Wellington," she said, moving to stand up. "I didn't expect anyone to be out here." "Please, don't get up," David said, settling beside her on the bench. "And call me David. What are you reading?" Rosa showed him the cover, a worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. "It's my grandmother's favorite book," she explained. "I'm reading it again to feel close to her." David looked at the Spanish text. "Would you read me some? I studied Spanish in school, but I was never very good at it." Rosa's voice was musical as she read passages about love and loss, family and time. David didn't understand all the words, but he understood the emotions in her voice. When she finished a particularly beautiful passage about enduring love, they sat in comfortable silence. "Rosa," David said finally, "I need to tell you something." She closed the book and turned to face him, her expression serious. "In 8 days, I have to choose a wife from the women my father selected. If I don't, I lose my inheritance, and the company will be sold." Rosa nodded slowly. "I know. The staff talks. Helena Morrison acts like she's already the lady of the house. The thing is," David continued, his heart pounding, "I don't want to marry any of them. They're all perfectly suitable according to my father's standards. But when I'm with them, I feel like I'm acting in a play. Nothing feels real." He paused, gathering courage. "When I'm with you, I feel like myself. You see me as a person, not as a prize or a business opportunity. You challenge me to be better, to think about what really matters. I've never felt this way about anyone before." Rosa was very still, her hands folded in her lap around the book. "I know this is crazy," David rushed on. "I know we come from completely different worlds. But I think I'm falling in love with you. And I needed you to know that before I make a decision that will affect the rest of my life." Rosa was quiet for so long that David began to fear he had made a terrible mistake. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "David, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know anything about my life, about who I really am." "Then tell me," David said urgently. "I want to know everything." Rosa stood up and walked a few steps away, her back to him. When she turned around, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm not just Rosa Martinez, the maid," she said quietly. "In Honduras, I was Rosa Esperanza Martinez Valdez. My father wasn't a poor farmer like I let people assume. He was Dr. Eduardo Martinez, one of the country's leading economists. My mother was Isabella Valdez, a prominent lawyer and human rights activist." David stared at her in shock. "We lived in a beautiful house in Tegucigalpa," Rosa continued. "I went to private schools and spoke 3 languages. I was studying international relations at university when the hurricane hit. But it wasn't just a natural disaster that destroyed my family. My parents were investigating corruption in the government's disaster relief funds. They died in what was officially called an accident. But many people believed they were murdered for getting too close to the truth." David felt the blood drain from his face. "Rosa, I had no idea. After my parents died, my family became targets," Rosa explained. "Government officials seized our house and froze our bank accounts. They claimed my father owed taxes, but it was really about silencing anyone who might continue his investigation. My siblings and I had to flee to my grandmother's village in the mountains. I came to America not just for work, but for safety." David was speechless. All this time, he had thought he was the one with privilege and education, and Rosa was the one who needed rescuing. The truth was far more complex. "So you see," Rosa continued, "I understand your world better than you think. I know what it's like to lose everything, to have to start over with nothing. But I also know what it's like to come from a family with expectations and responsibilities." "Why didn't you tell me before?" David asked. "Because I learned that in this country people see what they want to see," Rosa replied. "If they see a maid, they treat me like I'm invisible. If they see someone with education and a complicated past, They see problems they don't want to deal with. It was easier to just be Rosa the maid. David stood and walked over to her. "You're not invisible to me. You never were." Rosa looked up at him, and for a moment, David saw not the careful, composed woman who cleaned his house, but the intelligent, complicated person she really was. "What you're suggesting is impossible," Rosa said softly. "Your father would never accept me. I'm not on his list of approved wives." "I'm the help. My father's list is about business connections and social status," David replied. "But you have something none of those women have. You have integrity, compassion, and strength. You've overcome more challenges than any of us could imagine. You're exactly the kind of partner I would want beside me if I were really going to run Wellington Industries." "And what about your inheritance?" Rosa asked. "What about all the people whose jobs depend on the company?" It was the question David had been wrestling with for days. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe there's a way to convince my father. Maybe there's another solution we haven't thought of yet. All I know is that I can't marry someone I don't love, and I can't stop thinking about you." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "There's something else you should know," she said finally. "I care about you, too. More than I should, given our circumstances. When I was in Honduras burying my grandmother, I kept thinking about you, about our conversations, about your kindness, about the way you see the world. You're not the spoiled rich man the newspapers write about. You're thoughtful and generous, and you have the potential to be a great leader if you follow your heart instead of just your father's expectations." David felt hope bloom in his chest. "Then we can figure this out together." "Can we?" Rosa asked. "Even if your father accepted me, which he won't, the media would destroy us both. They would dig into my past, my family's political problems. It would become a scandal that could hurt the company anyway." David hadn't thought about the media attention, but Rosa was right. Their relationship would be front-page news, and not the kind that helped business. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. Mrs. Peterson appeared, looking flustered. "Master David, your father is looking for you," she said. "It's urgent." David and Rosa exchanged glances before hurrying back to the house. They found Marcus in his study with Helena Morrison and her father, Charles Morrison, who owned a chain of luxury hotels across Europe. "David, there you are," Marcus said, his voice strained. "We need to talk. Now." Helena smiled triumphantly, and David realized with sinking dread that some kind of decision had been made without him. "Charles and I have been discussing a merger between Wellington Industries and Morrison Hotels," Marcus explained. "It would create the largest luxury hospitality empire in the world. Helena's marriage to you would seal the partnership and guarantee both families' futures." "You're arranging my marriage as part of a business deal?" David asked incredulously. "I'm ensuring our family's survival," Marcus replied sharply. "I've received an offer from Blackstone Capital to buy Wellington Industries. They're willing to pay 20% above market value, and they want an answer by the end of the week. If you don't marry Helena, I'm going to sell to them." The threat hit David like a physical blow. Blackstone Capital was known for buying companies and immediately firing half the workforce to maximize profits. Thousands of jobs would disappear overnight. "You can't be serious," David said. "I've never been more serious," Marcus replied. "Marry Helena or watch everything we've built get torn apart by corporate raiders." David looked around the room at the faces watching him. Helena's confident smile, Charles Morrison's calculating eyes, his father's grim determination. They were all waiting for his decision, but none of them cared about what he actually wanted. "I need some time to think," David said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Marcus declared. "The lawyers will be here at 10 a.m. with either wedding contracts or sale agreements." As David left the study, his mind raced through impossible scenarios. How could he choose between his love for Rosa and his responsibility to thousands of employees? How could he condemn people to unemployment for his own happiness? Rosa was waiting for him in the hallway, her face pale. "You heard all that?" David asked. She nodded. The door wasn't completely closed. They walked to the kitchen in silence, both lost in thought. When they reached the familiar sanctuary where their relationship had begun, David slumped into a chair and put his head in his hands. "I can't do it," he said. "I can't marry Helena knowing I love you. But I also can't destroy all those jobs for my own selfish desires." Rosa sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "What if there was another way?" "What do you mean?" "What if you could save the company and still choose who you want to marry?" David looked up at her. "How?" Rosa took a deep breath. "What if you called your father's bluff? What if Blackstone's offer isn't as good as he claims? What if there are other options he hasn't considered? You think he's lying about the offer?" "I think he's a businessman who's used to controlling situations through fear and pressure," Rosa replied. "But I also think he loves you and the company more than he's willing to admit. Maybe if you stood up to him, really stood up to him, he might respect your choice." David considered her words. His father had always gotten his way through intimidation and ultimatums, but David had never seriously challenged him before. "Even if you're right," David said, "he would never accept you as a daughter-in-law. You heard what he said about marriage being a business arrangement." Rosa smiled sadly. "Then maybe it's time for him to learn that the most successful businesses are built on more than just profit margins. They're built on loyalty, integrity, and leaders who inspire others to be their best. Those are qualities that come from the heart, not from a contract." That night, David barely slept. He walked the halls of the mansion, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. By dawn, he had made his decision. At 10 a.m. sharp, David walked into his father's study where the lawyers, Helena and Charles Morrison, were waiting. Marcus looked up expectantly. "Well," Marcus asked, "what's your decision?" David stood straight and looked his father in the eye. "I'm not going to marry Helena Morrison." Helena gasped, and Charles Morrison's face turned red with anger. "Then you've chosen to sell the company," Marcus said coldly. "No," David replied firmly. "I'm choosing to run it myself, with the woman I love by my side." "What woman?" Marcus demanded. There was no one else on the list. David walked to the door and opened it. Rosa stepped inside, wearing a simple but elegant dress that somehow made her look more regal than Helena in all her designer clothes. "This is Rosa Martinez," David announced, "and she's going to be my wife." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus stared at Rosa with a mixture of shock and fury. "This is a joke," Marcus said finally. "You want to marry the maid?" "I want to marry an intelligent, compassionate woman who has overcome more challenges than anyone in this room," David replied. "A woman who understands both struggle and privilege, who values family and hard work, and who sees the best in people even when they don't see it in themselves." Rosa stepped forward with quiet dignity. "Mr. Wellington, I know this isn't what you wanted for your son, but I love David, and I believe we can build something meaningful together. Not just a marriage, but a partnership that honors both your legacy and our values." Marcus looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any idea what you're asking? The media scrutiny, the social complications, the business ramifications?" "We understand the challenges," David replied. "But we also understand that the best leaders are those who follow their convictions, rather than just following what's expected." Helena Morrison stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You're throwing away everything for some romantic fantasy with the help." Rosa turned to face Helena with calm composure. "I'm not the help. I have a master's degree in international relations from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras. My father was one of the country's leading economists, and my mother was a human rights lawyer. I've worked as a translator for the United Nations and speak 4 languages fluently. I took this job not because it was all I could do, but because it was what I needed to do to support my family and build a new life in this country." The room was stunned into silence. Even Marcus looked taken aback. David smiled with pride. "I probably should have mentioned that Rosa is far more qualified to help run an international company than any of us realized." Charles Morrison gathered his papers angrily. "This is a waste of time. Come, Helena. The Wellington family has clearly lost their minds." After the Morrisons left, Marcus sat heavily in his chair, looking older than David had ever seen him. "You realize what you've done," Marcus said quietly. "Morrison was our best opportunity for European expansion. Without that merger, we're vulnerable to the Blackstone takeover." "Then we'll find another way," David said. "Rosa has contacts in Latin America through her family's work. I know there are opportunities we haven't explored in emerging markets. Maybe it's time to stop thinking like our competitors and start innovating." Marcus looked at Rosa with new interest. "What kind of contacts?" Rosa straightened, slipping into a more formal tone that revealed her diplomatic training. "Before the political situation forced my family into hiding, we worked with development organizations throughout Central and South America. There are growing markets for sustainable tourism and ethical business practices in the region. Wellington Industries could be a leader in responsible development if you're willing to take a different approach." For the first time since David had known him, his father seemed genuinely surprised by something someone had said. "You think there's enough profit potential to offset losing the European markets?" Marcus asked. "I think there's potential for something more valuable than short-term profit," Rosa replied. "There's potential for building a company that people are proud to work for and that communities welcome rather than fear. That kind of reputation becomes its own competitive advantage." Marcus was quiet for a long time, studying both Rosa and David. Finally, he spoke. "You're asking me to trust the future of everything I've built to an untested business strategy and a relationship that defies every convention of our world." "We're asking you to trust us," David said simply. Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "You're not the same person who walked into this room 30 days ago." "No," David agreed. "I'm not, and that's because of her." Marcus turned his attention back to Rosa. "If I agree to this insanity, and if you two get married, you understand that you'll be representing the Wellington name, that every decision you make reflects on our family and our business?" "I understand," Rosa replied. "And I promise you that I'll never give you reason to regret your faith in us." Marcus was quiet for another long moment. Then, surprisingly, he began to smile. "You know," he said slowly, 35 years ago, I wanted to marry your mother instead of the woman my father had chosen for me. But I didn't have the courage to stand up to him the way you just stood up to me." David stared at his father in shock. "I never knew that." "There are many things you don't know about me," Marcus replied. "I spent so many years focused on building this empire that I forgot why I wanted to build it in the first place. It was supposed to be about creating something meaningful to pass on to future generations. But what good is an empire if the person inheriting it has no passion for it?" He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city he had helped shape. "I'm dying, David. And I've been so afraid of leaving you unprepared that I tried to control every aspect of your future. But maybe what you need isn't my plan for your life. Maybe what you need is the courage to create your own plan." Marcus turned back to face them. "Rosa, welcome to the family. David, you have my blessing to marry whomever you choose. And both of you better be ready to work harder than you've ever worked in your lives, because we're about to find out if love really can build an empire." 6 months later, David and Rosa were married in a small ceremony in the mansion's garden. the same garden where David had first told Rosa he was falling in love with her. The wedding was attended by Rosa's siblings, who had successfully immigrated to the United States with the family's help. Mrs. Peterson and the household staff who had become like family, and a handful of close friends and business associates. Marcus, defying his doctor's predictions, was not only alive but thriving. Working with Rosa on new business strategies had given him a renewed sense of purpose. Wellington Industries had successfully fended off the Blackstone takeover by securing partnerships in 3 Latin American countries, creating sustainable tourism projects that benefited local communities while generating impressive profits. Rosa had proven to be a natural at international business, using her language skills and cultural knowledge to build relationships that traditional corporate approaches had failed to establish. David had found his passion for the company by focusing on the human side of business, employee development, community engagement, and ethical practices that attracted both customers and top talent. As they exchanged vows in the garden, surrounded by people who truly knew and loved them, David reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He had started 30 days earlier, thinking he needed to choose between his father's list of approved wives and losing everything he had been raised to value. Instead, he had discovered that the most important choice wasn't about pleasing his father or preserving his inheritance. It was about having the courage to follow his heart and trust that love, integrity, and genuine partnership could build something more lasting and meaningful than any business arrangement. Rosa had taught him that true strength comes from understanding others, that real leadership means lifting people up rather than just climbing higher yourself, and that the best investments are the ones you make in relationships and values rather than just profit margins. As they kissed to seal their marriage, the future spread out before them full of challenges and possibilities. They would face social scrutiny, business pressures, and the normal struggles that all couples encounter, but they would face them together, as equal partners who had chosen each other not because it was convenient or profitable, but because they had found something rare and precious that was worth fighting for. Marcus, watching his son begin this new chapter of his life, realized that his real legacy wouldn't be measured in dollars or market share. It would be measured in whether he had raised a man capable of choosing love over fear, principle over convenience, and hope over cynicism. And as David and Rosa danced their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by family and friends who had supported their unlikely love story, Marcus knew that the Wellington Empire was in exactly the right hands.